Ahoy again, it's me, Ron Gabaldon. I'd like to thank everyone out there who's been subscribing and commenting or just generally viewing and liking and enjoying these readings of Kurt Vonnegut. It's a lot of fun for me to do. I find that after so many years of having read these, going through them again and rereading them, I find I get a lot more out of it than I did the first time I read them. So I'm glad you're enjoying it too, and thanks again. Here's where we are with the book Slapstick. Dr. Swain has been visited by a minuscule Chinese man named Fu Manchu, who was very interested to see the papers that he and his sister had written and stashed away back when they were 15 in the mausoleum of Professor Elihu Roosevelt Swain. In particular, he wanted to see the paper about variable gravity and its effect throughout Earth's history. Other than that, the Chinese have become increasingly isolated, figuring there was nothing more they could learn from anywhere else in the world. Rumors had it that they had made incredible advances in science and technology and even established a colony on Mars. Sometime after this interaction, Dr. Swain receives 2 telegrams in the mail. One of them is from his sister, celebrating their shared birthday and informing him that she was moving to the Chinese colony on Mars. The second was from Fu Manchu, informing him that his sister had died in an avalanche on the Chinese colony on Mars. This was when Earth has its first jolt of destructive heavy gravity, which shatters the infrastructure and pretty much ruins America. Dr. Swain decides, though, that he's going to run for president anyway, on the single policy platform of artificial extended families, a scheme to subdue loneliness in America. Turns out to be a very, very popular policy in a ruined America. A policy that even survives the cataclysms of gravity and plagues. In this next part, Dr. Swain, former President of the United States, takes a little trip. It's a lot of fun. Hi-ho. Slapstick by Kurt Vonnegut, Part 5, Chapters 39 through 49, and Epilogue. Read by Ron Gabaldon. Chapter 39. But then, just when everything was going so well, when Americans were happier than they had ever been, even though the country was bankrupt and falling apart, people began to die by the millions of the Albanian flu in most places, and here on Manhattan of the Green Death. And that was the end of the nation. It became families, and nothing more. Hi-ho. Oh, there were claims of dukedoms and kingdoms and such garbage, and armies were raised and forts were built here and there, but few people admired them. They were just more bad weather and more bad gravity that families endured from time to time. And somewhere in there, a night of actual bad gravity crumbled the foundations of Machu Picchu. The condominiums and boutiques and banks and gold bricks and jewelry and pre-Columbian art collections and the opera house and the churches and all that eloped down the Andes, wound up in the sea. I cried. And families painted pictures everywhere of the kidnapped Jesus Christ. People continued to send news to us at the White House for a little while. We ourselves were experiencing death and death and death and expecting to die. Our personal hygiene deteriorated quickly. We stopped bathing and brushing our teeth regularly. The males grew beards and let their hair grow down to their shoulders. We began to cannibalize the White House almost absent-mindedly, burning furniture and banisters and paneling and picture frames and so on in the fireplaces to keep warm. Hortense Muskellunge 13 McBundy, my personal secretary, died of flu. My valet, Edward Strawberry 4 Kleindienst, died of flu. My vice president, Mildred Helium-20 Theodorides, died of flu. My science advisor, Dr. Albert Aquamarine 1 Piatigorsky, actually expired in my arms on the floor of the Oval Office. He was almost as tall as I was. We must have been quite a sight on the floor.
"What does it all mean?"
he said over and over again. "I don't know, Albert," I said, "and maybe I'm glad I don't know."
"Ask a Chinaman,"
he said, and he went to his reward, as the saying goes. Now and then the telephone would ring. It became such a rare occurrence that I took to answering it personally. "This is your president speaking," I would say. As like as not, I would find myself talking over a tenuous, crackling circuit to some sort of mythological creature. The King of Michigan, perhaps, or the emergency governor of Florida, or the acting mayor of Birmingham, or some such thing. But there were fewer messages with each passing week. At last, there were none. I was forgotten. Thus did my presidency end, 2/3 of the way through my second term. And something else crucial was petering out almost as quickly, which was my irreplaceable supply of tribenzodiportamil. Hi-ho. I dared not count my remaining pills until I could not help but count them. They were so few. I had become so dependent upon them, so grateful for them, that it seemed to me that my life would end when the last one was gone. I was running out of employees, too. I was soon down to one. Everybody else had died or wandered away, since there weren't any messages anymore. The one person who remained with me was my brother, was faithful Carlos Daffodil-11 Villavicencio, the dishwasher I had embraced on my first day as a daffodil. Chapter 40. Because everything had dwindled away so quickly, and because there was no one to behave sanely for anymore, I developed a mania for counting things. I counted slats in Venetian blinds. I counted the knives and forks and spoons in the kitchen. I counted tufts of the coverlet on Abraham Lincoln's bed. And I was counting posts in a banister one day on my hands and knees on the staircase, although the gravity was medium to light. And then I realized that a man was watching me from below. He was dressed in buckskins and moccasins and a coonskin hat, and carried a rifle. "My God, President Daffodil," I said to myself, "you've really gone crazy this time. That's old Daniel Boone down there." And then another man joined the first one. He was dressed like a military pilot back in the days, long before I was president, when there had been such a thing as the United States Air Force. "Let me guess," I said out loud. "It's either Halloween or the 4th of July." The pilot seemed to be shocked by the condition of the White House. "What's happened here?" he said. "All I can tell you," I said, "is that history has been made." "This is terrible," he said. "If you think this is bad," I told him, and I tapped my forehead with my fingertips, "you should see what it looks like in here." Neither one of them even suspected that I was the president. I had become quite a mess by then. They did not even want to talk to me, or to each other for that matter. They were strangers, it turned out. They had simply happened to arrive at the same time, each one on an urgent mission. They went into the other rooms and found my Sancho Panza, Carlos Daffodil-11 Villavicencio, who was making a lunch of Navy hardtack and canned smoked oysters, and some other things he'd found. And Carlos brought them back to me, and convinced them that I was indeed the president of what he called, in all sincerity, the most powerful country in the world. Carlos was a really stupid man. The frontiersman had a letter for me from the widow in Urbana, Illinois, who had been visited a few years before by the Chinese. I had been too busy ever to find out what the Chinese had been after out there. "Dear Dr. Swain," it began, "I am an undistinguished person, a piano teacher who is remarkable only for having been married to a very great physicist, to have had a beautiful son by him, and after his death to have been visited by a delegation of very small Chinese, one of whom said his father had known you. His father's name was Fu Manchu. It was the Chinese who told me about the astonishing discovery by my husband, Dr. Felix Bauxite 13 von Peterswald, made just before he died. My son, who is incidentally a Daffodil 11 like yourself, and I have kept this discovery a secret ever since, because the light it throws on the situation of human beings in the universe is very demoralizing, to say the least. It has to do with the true nature of what awaits us all after death. What awaits us, Dr. Swain, is tedious in the extreme. I can't bring myself to call it heaven or our just reward or any of those sweet things. All I can call it is what my husband came to call it, and what you will call it too after you have investigated it, which is the turkey farm. In short, Dr. Swain, my husband discovered a way to talk to dead people on the turkey farm. He never taught the technique to me or to my son or to anybody, but the Chinese, who apparently have spies everywhere, somehow found out about it. They came to study his journals and to see what was left of his apparatus. After they had figured it out, they were nice enough to explain to my son and me how we might do the gruesome trick, if we wished to. They themselves were disappointed with the discovery. It was new to them, they said, but could be interesting only to participants in what is left of Western civilization, whatever that means.
I am entrusting this letter to a friend who hopes to join a large settlement of his artificial relatives, the berylliums in Maryland, which is very near you. I address you as Dr. Swain rather than Mr. President, because this letter has nothing to do with the national interest. It is a highly personal letter, informing you that we have spoken to your dead sister Eliza many times on my husband's apparatus. She says that it is of the utmost importance that you come here in order that she may converse directly with you. We eagerly await your visit. Please do not be insulted by the behavior of my son and your brother, David Daffodil-11 von Peterswald, who cannot prevent himself from speaking obscenities and making insulting gestures at even the most inappropriate moments. He is a victim of Tourette's disease. Your faithful servant, Wilma Pachysandra 17 von Peterswald.
Hi-ho. Chapter 41. I was deeply moved, despite tribenzodiportamil. I stared out at the frontiersman's sweaty horse, which was grazing in the high grass of the White House lawn, and then I turned to the messenger himself. "How came you by this message?" I said. He told me that he had accidentally shot a man, apparently Wilma Pachysandra 17 von Peterswald's friend, the beryllium, on the border between Tennessee and West Virginia. He had mistaken him for an hereditary enemy. "I thought he was a Newton McCoy," he said. He tried to nurse his innocent victim back to health, but he died of gangrene. But before he died, the beryllium made him promise as a Christian to deliver a letter he had himself sworn to hand over to the President of the United States. I asked him his name. "Byron Hatfield," he said. "I thought he was a Newton McCoy." "What is your government-issue middle name?" I said. "We never paid no mind to that," he replied. It turned out that he belonged to one of the few genuine extended families of blood relatives in the country, which had been at perpetual war with another such family since 1882. "We never was big for them newfangled middle names," he said. The frontiersman and I were seated on spindly golden ballroom chairs, which had supposedly been bought for the White House by Jacqueline Kennedy so long ago. The pilot was similarly supported, alertly waiting his turn to speak. I glanced at the nameplate over the breast pocket of the pilot. It said this: Captain Bernard O'Hare. "Captain," I said, "you're another one who doesn't seem to go in for the newfangled middle names." I noticed, too, that he was much too old to be only a captain, even if there had been such a thing. He was, in fact, almost 60. I concluded that he was a lunatic who had found the costume somewhere. I supposed that he had become so elated and addled by his new appearance that nothing would do but that he show himself off to his president. The truth was, though, that he was perfectly sane. He had been stationed for the past 11 years in the bottom of a secret underground silo in Rock Creek Park. I had never heard of the silo before. But there was a presidential helicopter concealed in it, along with thousands of gallons of absolutely priceless gasoline. He had come out at last, in violation of his orders, he said, to find out What on earth was going on? I had to laugh. "Is the helicopter still ready to fly?" I asked. "Yes, sir, it is," he said. He had been maintaining it single-handedly for the past 2 years. His mechanics had wandered off one by one. "Young man," I said, "I'm going to give you a medal for this." I took a button from my own tattered lapel, and I pinned it to his. It said this, of course: "Lonesome no more." Chapter 42. The frontiersman refused a similar decoration. He asked for food instead, to sustain him on his long trip back to his native mountains. We gave him what we had, which was all the hardtack and canned smoked oysters his saddlebags would hold. Yes, and Captain Bernard O'Hare and Carlos Daffodil-11 Villavicencio and I took off from the silo on the following dawn. It was a day of such salubrious gravity that our helicopter expended no more energy than would have an airborne milkweed seed. As we fluttered over the White House, I waved to it. "Goodbye," I said. My plan was to first fly to Indianapolis, which had become densely populated with daffodils. They had been flocking there from everywhere. We would leave Carlos there, to be cared for by his artificial relatives during his sunset years. I was glad to be getting rid of him. He bored me to tears. We would go next to Urbana, I told Captain O'Hare, and then to my childhood home in Vermont. After that, I promised, the helicopter is yours, Captain. You can fly like a bird wherever you wish. But you're going to have a rotten time of it if you don't give yourself a good middle name. "You're the president," he said. "You give me a name." "I dub thee Eagle One," I said. He was awfully pleased. He loved the medal, too. Yes, and I still had a little tribenzodiportamil left, and I was so delighted to be going simply anywhere after having been cooped up in Washington, D.C. so long, that I heard myself singing for the first time in years. I remember the song I sang, too. It was one Eliza and I used to sing a lot in secret, back when we were still believed to be idiots. We would sing it where nobody could hear us, in the mausoleum of Professor Elihu Roosevelt Swain. And I think now that I will teach it to Melody and Isidore at my birthday party. It is such a good song for them to sing when they set out for new adventures on the island of death. It goes like this. "Oh, we're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz. If ever a whiz of a whiz there was, it was the Wizard of Oz." And so on. Hi-ho. Chapter 43. Melody and Isidore went down to Wall Street today to visit Isidore's large family, the Raspberries. I was invited to become a raspberry at one time. So was Vera Chipmunk 5 Zappa. We both declined. Yes, and I took a walk of my own, up to the Babies' Pyramid at Broadway and 42nd, then across 43rd Street to the Old Daffodil Club. to what had been the Century Association before that, and then eastward across 48th Street to the townhouse which was slave quarters for Vera's farm, which at one time had been my parents' home. I encountered Vera herself on the steps of the townhouse. Her slaves were all over in what used to be United Nations Park, planting watermelons and corn and sunflowers. I could hear them singing Old Man River. They were so happy all the time. They considered themselves very lucky to be slaves. They were all Chipmunk Fives, and about 2/3 of them were former Raspberries. People who wished to become slaves of Vera had to change their middle names to Chipmunk Five. Hi-ho. Vera usually labored right along with her slaves. She loved hard work. But now I caught her tinkering idly with a beautiful Zeiss microscope, which one of her slaves had unearthed in the ruins of a hospital only the day before. It had been protected all through the years by its original factory packing case. Vera had not sensed my approach. She was peering into the instrument and turning knobs with childlike seriousness and ineptitude. It was obvious that she had never used a microscope before. I stole closer to her, and then I said, "Boo!" She jerked her head away from the eyepiece. "Hello," I said. "You scared me to death," she said. "Sorry," I said, and I laughed. These ancient games go on and on. It's nice that they do. "I can't see anything," she said. She was complaining about the microscope. "Just squiggly little animals that want to kill and eat us," I said. "You really want to see those?" "I was looking at an opal," she said. She had draped an opal and diamond bracelet over the stage of the microscope. She had a collection of precious stones which would have been worth millions of dollars in olden times. People gave her all the jewels they found, just as they gave me all the candlesticks. Jewels were useless. So were candlesticks, since there weren't such things on Manhattan as candles anymore. People lit their homes at night with burning rags stuck in bowls of animal fat. "There's probably green death on the opal," I said. "There's probably green death on everything." The reason that we ourselves did not die of the green death, by the way, was that we took an antidote which was discovered by accident by Isidore's family, the Raspberries. We had only to withhold the antidote from a troublemaker, or from an army of troublemakers for that matter, and he or she or they would be exiled quickly to the afterlife, or to the turkey farm. There weren't any great scientists among the Raspberries, incidentally. They discovered the antidote through dumb luck. They ate fish without cleaning them, and the antidote, probably pollution left over from olden times, was somewhere in the guts of the fish they ate. "Vera," I said, "if you ever got that microscope to work, you would see something that would break your heart." "What would break my heart?" she said. "You'd see the organisms that cause the green death," I said. "Why would that make me cry?" she said. "Because you're a woman of conscience," I said. "Don't you realize that we kill them by the trillions every time we take our antidote?" I laughed. She did not laugh. "The reason I am not laughing," she said,
is that you coming along so unexpectedly have spoiled a surprise for your birthday."
"How is that?" I said. She spoke of one of her slaves.
"Donna was gonna make a present of this to you. Now you won't be surprised."
I said.
"She thought it was an extra fancy kind of candlestick."
She confided to me that Melody and Isidore had paid her a call earlier in the week, had told her again how much they hoped to be her slaves someday.
"I tried to tell him that slavery wasn't for everybody,"
she said.
"Answer me this," she went on. "What happens to all my slaves when I die?"
"Take no thought for the morrow," I told her. "For the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." "Amen," I said. Chapter 44. Old Vera and I reminisced there on the townhouse steps about the Battle of Lake Maxinkuckee in northern Indiana. I had seen it from a helicopter on my way to Urbana. Vera had been in the actual thick of it with her alcoholic husband, Lee Razor Clam 13 Zappa. They were cooks in one of the King of Michigan's field kitchens on the ground below. "You all looked like ants to me down there," I said, "or like germs under a microscope. We didn't dare come down close for fear of being shot."
"That's what we felt like, too,"
she said. "If I had known you then, I would have tried to rescue you," I said.
"That would be like trying to rescue a germ from a million other germs, Wilbur," she said. Not only did Vera have to put up with shells and bullets whistling over the kitchen tent, she had to defend herself against her husband, too, who was drunk. He beat her up in the midst of battle. He blacked both her eyes and broke her jaw. He threw her out through the tent flaps. She landed on her back in the mud. Then he came out to explain to her how she could avoid similar beatings in the future. He came out just in time to be skewered by the lance of an enemy cavalryman. "And what's the moral of that story, do you think?" I asked her. She lay a calloused palm on my knee. "Wilbur, don't ever get married," she replied.
We talked some about Indianapolis, which I had seen on the same trip, and where she and her husband had been a waitress and a bartender for a 13 club before they joined the army of the King of Michigan. I asked her what the club was like inside.
"Oh, you know," she said. "They had stuffed black cats and jack-o'-lanterns and ace of spades stuck to the tables with daggers and all. I used to wear net stockings and spike heels and a mask and all. All the waitresses and the bartenders and the bouncer wore vampire fangs."
I said.
"We used to call our hamburgers bat burgers," she said.
"Uh-huh," I said.
"We used to call tomato juice with a shot of gin a Dracula's delight," she said.
"Right," I said.
"It was just like a 13 club anywhere," she said. "But it never went over. Indianapolis just wasn't a big 13 town, even though there were plenty of 13s there. It was a daffodil town. You weren't anything if you weren't a daffodil."
Chapter 45. I tell you, I have been regaled as a multimillionaire, as a pediatrician, as a senator, and as a president. But nothing can match for sincerity the welcome Indianapolis, Indiana gave me as a daffodil. The people there were poor and had suffered an awful lot of death, and all the public services had broken down, and they were worried about battles raging not far away. But they put on parades and feasts for me, and for Carlos Daffodil-11 Villavicencio too, of course, which would have blinded ancient Rome. Captain Bernard Eagle 1 O'Hare said to me, "My gosh, Mr. President, if I'd known about this, I would have asked you to make me a daffodil." So I said, "I hereby dub thee a daffodil." But the most satisfying and educational thing I saw out there was a weekly family meeting of daffodils. Yes, and I got to vote at that meeting. And so did my pilot. And so did Carlos. And so did every man, woman, and every child over the age of 9. With a little luck, I might even have become chairperson of the meeting, although I had been in town for less than a day. The chairperson was chosen by lot from all assembled, and the winner of the drawing that night was an 11-year-old black girl named Dorothy Daffodil 7 Garland. She was fully prepared to run the meeting, and so, I suppose, was every person there. She marched up to the lectern, which was nearly as tall as she was. That little cousin of mine stood on a chair without any apologies or self-mockery. She banged the meeting to order with a yellow gavel, and she told her silenced and respectful relatives, "The President of the United States is present, as most of you know. With your permission, I will ask him to say a few words to us at the conclusion of our regular business. Will somebody put that in the form of a motion?" she said. "I move that Cousin Wilbur be asked to address the meeting at the conclusion of regular business," said an old man sitting next to me. This was seconded and put to a voice vote. The motion carried, but with a scattering of seemingly heartfelt, by no means joshing, nays and noes. Hi-ho. The most pressing business had to do with selecting 4 replacements for fallen daffodils in the army of the King of Michigan, who was at war simultaneously with Great Lakes pirates and the Duke of Oklahoma. There was one strapping young man, I remember, a blacksmith, in fact, who told the meeting, "Send me. There's nothing I'd rather do than kill me some Sooners, as long as they ain't daffodils," and so on. To my surprise, he was scolded by several speakers for his military ardor. He was told that war wasn't supposed to be fun, and in fact wasn't fun, that tragedy was being discussed, and that he had better put on a tragic face or he would be ejected from the meeting. Sooners were people from Oklahoma, and by extension anybody in the service of the Duke of Oklahoma, which included Shomies from Missouri and Jayhawkers from Kansas and Hawkeyes from Iowa, and on and on. The blacksmith was told that Sooners were human beings too, no better or worse than Hoosiers, who were people from Indiana. And the old man who had moved that I be allowed to speak later on got up and said this, "Young man, you're no better than the Albanian influenza or the Green Death if you can kill for joy." I was impressed. I realized that nations could never acknowledge their own wars as tragedies, but that families not only could, but had to. Bully for them. The chief reason the blacksmith was not allowed to go to war, though, was that he had so far fathered 3 illegitimate children by different women, and had 2 more in the oven, as someone said. He wasn't going to be allowed to run away from caring for all those babies. Chapter 46. Even the children and the drunks and the lunatics at that meeting seemed shrewdly familiar with parliamentary procedures. The little girl behind the lectern kept things moving so briskly and purposefully that she might have been some sort of goddess up there, equipped with an armload of thunderbolts. I was so filled with respect for these procedures, which had always seemed like such solemn tomfoolery to me before, and I am still so respectful that I have just looked up their inventor in my encyclopedia here in the Empire State Building. His name was Henry Martin Robert. He was a graduate of West Point. He was an engineer. He became a general by and by, but just before the Civil War, when he was a lieutenant stationed in New Bedford, Massachusetts, he had to run a church meeting and he lost control of it. There were no rules. So, this soldier sat down and wrote some rules, which were the identical rules I saw followed in Indianapolis. They were published as Robert's Rules of Order, which I now believe to be one of the 4 greatest inventions by Americans. The other 3, in my opinion, were the Bill of Rights, the Principles of Alcoholics Anonymous, and the artificial extended families envisioned by Eliza and me. The 3 recruits which the Indianapolis Daffodils finally voted to send off to the King of Michigan, incidentally, were all people who could be most easily spared, and who, in the opinion of the voters, had had the most carefree lives so far. Hi-ho. The next order of business had to do with feeding and sheltering daffodil refugees, who were trickling into town from all the fighting in the northern part of the state. The meeting again discouraged an enthusiast, a young woman, quite beautiful but disorderly, and clearly crazed by altruism, said that she could take at least 20 refugees into her home. Somebody else got up and said to her that she was such an incompetent housekeeper that her own children had gone to live with other relatives. Another person pointed out to her that she was so absent-minded that her dog would have starved to death if it weren't for neighbors, and that she had accidentally set fire to her house 3 times. This sounds as though the people at the meeting were being cruel, but they all called her Cousin Grace or Sister Grace, as the case might be. She was my cousin, too, of course. She was a Daffodil 13. What was more, she was a menace only to herself, so nobody was particularly mad at her. Her children had wandered off to better run houses almost as soon as they were able to walk, I was told. That was surely one of the most attractive features of Eliza's and my invention, I think. Children had so many homes and parents to choose from. Cousin Grace, for her part, heard all the bad reports on herself as though they were surprising to her, but no doubt true. She did not flee in tears. She stayed for the rest of the meeting, obeying Robert's rules of order, and looking sympathetic and alert. At one point, under new business, Cousin Grace made a motion that any daffodil who served with the Great Lakes Pirates or in the army of the Duke of Oklahoma should be expelled from the family. Nobody would second this. And the little girl running the meeting told her,
Cousin Grace, you know as well as anybody here, once a daffodil, always a daffodil.
Chapter 47. It was at last my turn to speak. Brothers and sisters and cousins, I said, your nation has wasted away. As you can see, your president has also become a shadow of his former shadow. You have nobody but your doddering Cousin Wilbur here.
You are a damn good president, Brother Billy,
somebody called from the back of the room. I would have liked to give my country peace as well as brotherhood and sisterhood, I went on. There is no peace, I'm sorry to say. We find it, we lose it, we find it again, we lose it again. Thank God, at least, that the machines have decided not to fight anymore. It's just people now. And thank God that there is no such thing as a battle between strangers anymore. I don't care who fights who. Everybody will have relatives on the other side. Most of the people at the meeting were not only daffodils, but also searchers for the kidnapped Jesus. It was a disconcerting sort of audience to address, I found. No matter what I said, they kept jerking their heads this way and that, hoping to catch sight of Jesus. But I seemed to be getting across, for they applauded or cheered at appropriate moments. So I pressed on. Because we're just families and not a nation anymore, I said, it's much easier for us to give and receive mercy in war. I have just come from observing a battle far to the north of here, in the region of Lake Maxinkuckee. It was horses and spears and rifles and knives and pistols and a cannon or two. I saw several people killed. I also saw many people embracing. And there seemed to be a great deal of deserting and surrendering going on. This much news I can bring you from the Battle of Lake Maxinkuckee, I said. It is no massacre. Chapter 48. While in Indianapolis, I received an invitation by radio from the King of Michigan. It was Napoleonic in tone. It said that the king would be pleased to hold an audience for the President of the United States in his summer palace on Lake Maxinkuckee. It said that his sentinels had been instructed to grant me safe passage. It said that the battle was over. Victory is ours, it said. So my pilot and I flew there. We left my faithful servant, Carlos Daffodil-11 Villavicencio, to spend his declining years among his countless relatives. Good luck, Brother Carlos, I said.
Home at last, Mr. President, me brother,
he replied.
Thanks you and thanks God for everything. Lonesome no more.
My meeting with the King of Michigan would have been called an historic occasion in olden times. There would have been cameras and microphones and reporters there. As it was, there were note-takers there, whom the king called his scribes. And he was right to give those people with pens and paper that archaic title. Most of his soldiers could scarcely read or write. Captain O'Hare and I landed on the manicured lawn before the King's Summer Palace, which had been a private military academy at one time. Soldiers who had behaved badly in the recent battle, I suppose, were on their knees everywhere, guarded by military policemen. They were cutting grass with bayonets and pocket knives and scissors as a punishment. Captain O'Hare and I entered the palace between two lines of soldiers. They were an honor guard of some sort, I suppose. Each one held aloft a banner, which was embroidered with the totem of his artificial extended family. An apple, an alligator, the chemical symbol for lithium, and so on. It was such a comically trite historical situation, I thought. Aside from battles, the history of nations seemed to consist of nothing but powerless old poops like myself, heavily medicated and vaguely beloved in the long ago, coming to kiss the boots of young psychopaths. Inside myself, I had to laugh. I was ushered alone into the King's Spartan private quarters. It was a huge room where the military academy must have held dances at one time. Now there was only a folding cot in there, a long table covered with maps, and a stack of folding chairs against one wall. The king himself sat at the map table, ostentatiously reading a book, which turned out to be Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. Behind him, standing, were 3 male scribes with pencils and pads. There was no place for me or anyone else to sit. I positioned myself before him, my moldy Homburg in hand. He did not look up from his book immediately, although the doorkeeper had certainly announced me loudly enough. "Your Majesty," the doorkeeper had said, "Dr. Wilbur Daffodil-11 Swain, the President of the United States." He looked up at last, and I was amused to see that he was the spit and image of his grandfather, Dr. Stuart Rawlings Mott, the physician who had looked after my sister and me in Vermont so long ago. I was not in the least afraid of him. Tribenzodiportamil was making me soigné and blasé, of course, but I also had had more than enough of the low comedy of living by then. I would have found it a rather shapely adventure if the king had elected to hustle me in front of a firing squad. "We thought you were dead," he said. "No, Your Majesty," I said. "It's been so long since we heard anything about you," he said. "Washington, D.C. runs out of ideas from time to time," I said. The scribes were taking all this down, all this history that was being made. He held up the spine of the book so I could read it. "Thucydides," he said. I said. "History is all I read," he said. "That is wise for a man in your position, Your Majesty," I replied. "Those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it," he said. The scribes scribbled away. "Yes," I said. "If our descendants don't study our times closely, they will find that they have again exhausted the planet's fossil fuels, that they have again died by the millions of influenza and the Green Death, that the sky has again been turned yellow by the propellants for underarm deodorants, that they have again elected a senile president 2 meters tall, and that they are yet again the intellectual and spiritual inferiors of teeny-weeny Chinese. He did not join my laughter. I addressed his scribes directly, speaking over his head. History is merely a list of surprises, I said. It can only prepare us to be surprised yet again. Please write that down. Chapter 49. It turned out that the young king had an historic document he wished me to sign. It was brief. In it, I acknowledged that I, the President of the United States of America, no longer exercised any control over that part of the North American continent which was sold by Napoleon Bonaparte to my country in 1803, and which was known as the Louisiana Purchase. I, therefore, according to the document, sold it for $1 to Stuart Oriel II Mott, the King of Michigan. I signed with the teeny-weeniest signature possible. It looked like a baby ant. "Enjoy it in good health," I said. The territory I sold him was largely occupied by the Duke of Oklahoma and, no doubt, by other potentates and pangendrums unknown to me. After that, we chatted some about his grandfather. Then, Captain O'Hare and I took off for Urbana, Illinois, and an electronic reunion with my sister, who had been dead for so long. Hi-ho. Yes, and I write now with a palsied hand and an aching head, for I drank too much at my birthday party last night. Vera Chipmunk 5 Zappa arrived encrusted with diamonds, borne through the ailanthus forest in a sedan chair, accompanied by an entourage of 14 slaves. She brought me wine and beer, which made me drunk, but her most intoxicating gifts were 1,000 candles she and her slaves had made in a colonial candle mold. We fitted them into the empty mouths of my 1,000 candlesticks and deployed them over the lobby floor. Then we lit them all. Standing among all those tiny, wavering lights, I felt as though I were God, up to my knees in the Milky Way. Epilogue. Dr. Swain died before he could write any more. He went to his just reward. There was nobody to read what he had written anyway, to complain about all those loose ends of the yarn he had spun. He had reached the climax of his story, at any rate, with his reselling of the Louisiana Purchase to a bandit chief for $1 he never received. Yes, and he died proud of what he and his sister had done to reform their society, for he left this poem, perhaps hoping that somebody would use it for his epitaph. And how did we then face the odds of man's rude slapstick, yes, and God's, quite at home and unafraid, thank you, in a game our dreams remade. He never got to tell about the electronic device in Urbana, which made it possible for him to reunite his mind with that of his dead sister, to recreate the genius they had been in childhood. The device, which those few people who knew about it called the hooligan, consisted of a seemingly ordinary length of brown clay pipe, 2 meters long and 20 centimeters in diameter. It was placed just so,
atop a steel cabinet containing controls for a huge particle accelerator. The particle accelerator was a tubular magnetic racetrack for subatomic particles which looped through cornfields on the edge of town. Yes, and the hooligan itself was a ghost, in a way, since the particle accelerator had been dead for a long time, for want of electricity, for want of enthusiasts for all it could do. A janitor, Francis Iron 7 Hooligan, stored the piece of pipe atop the dead cabinet, rested his lunch pail there, too, for the moment. He heard voices from the pipe. He fetched the scientist whose apparatus this had been, Dr. Felix Bauxite 13 von Peterswald, but the pipe refused to talk again. Dr. von Peterswald demonstrated that he was a great scientist, however, with his willingness to believe the ignorant Mr. Hooligan. He made the janitor go over his story again and again. "The lunch pail," he said at last. "Where is your lunch pail?" Hooligan had it in his hand. Dr. von Peterswald instructed him to place it in relation to the pipe exactly as it had been before. The pipe began promptly to talk again. The talkers identified themselves as persons in the afterlife. They were backed by a demoralized chorus of persons who complained to each other of tedium and social slights and minor ailments and so on. As Dr. von Peterswald said in his secret diary, it sounded like nothing so much as the other end of a telephone call on a rainy autumn day. To a badly run turkey farm. Hi-ho. When Dr. Swain talked to his sister Eliza over the hooligan, he was in the company of the widow of Dr. von Peterswald, Wilma Pachysandra 17 von Peterswald, and her 15-year-old son, David Daffodil-11 von Peterswald, a brother of Dr. Swain and a victim of Tourette's disease. Poor David suffered an attack of his disease just as Dr. Swain was beginning to talk with Eliza across the Great Divide. David tried to choke down the involuntary stream of obscenities, but succeeded in only raising their pitch an octave. "Shit! Sputum! Scrotum! Cloaca! Asshole! Pecker! Mucous membrane! Airwax! Piss!" he said. And Dr. Swain himself went out of control. He climbed involuntarily on top of the cabinet, as tall and old as he was. He crouched over the pipe to be that much closer to his sister. He hung his head upside down in front of the business end of the pipe and knocked the crucial lunch pail to the floor, breaking the connection. "Hello? Hello?" he said. "Perineum! Fuck! Turd! Glands! Mount of Venus! Afterbirth!" said the boy. The widow von Peterswald was the only stable person on the Urbana end, so it was she who restored the lunch pail to its correct position. She had to jam it rather brutally between the pipe and the knee of the president. Then she found herself trapped in a grotesque position, bent at a right angle across the top of the cabinet, one arm extended and her feet a few inches off the floor. The president had clamped down not only on the lunch pail, but on her hand. "Hello! Hello!" said the president, his head upside down. There were these gabblings and gobblings and squawks and clucks from the other end. Somebody sneezed. "Bugger! Defecate! Semen! Balls!" said the boy. Before Eliza could speak again, dead people in the background sensed that poor David was a kindred spirit, as outraged by the human condition in the universe as they were. So they egged him on, and contributed obscenities of their own. "You tell 'em, kid," they said, and so on. And they doubled everything. "Double cock, double clit," they'd say, "double shit," and so on. It was bedlam. But Dr. Swain and his sister got together anyway, with such convulsive intimacy that Dr. Swain would have crawled into the pipe if he could. Yes, and what Eliza wanted from him was that he should die as soon as possible, so that the two of them could put their heads together. She wanted them to figure out ways to improve the utterly unsatisfactory so-called paradise.
Are you being tortured there? He asked her.
No, she said. We are being bored stiff. Whoever designed this place knew nothing about human beings. Please, Brother Wilbur, she said. This is eternity here. This is forever. Where you are now is just nothing in terms of time. It's a joke. Blow your brains out as quick as you can.
And so on. Dr. Swain told her about the problems the living had been having with incurable diseases. The two of them, thinking as one, made child's play of the mystery. The explanation was this. The flu germs were Martians, whose invasion had apparently been repelled by antibodies in the systems of the survivors, since, for the moment anyway, there was no more flu. The Green Death, on the other hand, was caused by microscopic Chinese, who were peace-loving and meant no one any harm. They were nonetheless invariably fatal to normal-sized human beings when inhaled or ingested. And so on. Dr. Swain asked his sister what sort of communications apparatus there was on the other end, whether Eliza too was squatting over a piece of pipe or what. Eliza told him that there was no apparatus, but only a feeling. "What is the feeling?" he said.
You would have to be dead to understand my description of it, she said.
Try it anyway, Eliza, he said.
It is like being dead, she said.
A feeling of deadness, he said tentatively, trying to understand.
Yes, coldness and clamminess, she said.
He said.
But also like being surrounded by a swarm of invisible bees, she said. Your voice comes from the bees.
Hi-ho. When Dr. Swain was through with this particular ordeal, he had only 11 tablets left of tribenzodiportamil, which were originally created, of course, not as a narcotic for presidents, but as suppressants for the symptoms of Tourette's disease. And the remaining pills, when he displayed them to himself in the palm of his huge hand, inevitably looked to him like the remaining grains in the hourglass of his life. Dr. Swain was standing in the sunshine outside the laboratory building containing the hooligan. With him were the widow and her son. The widow had the lunch pail so that only she could turn the hooligan on. The gravity was light. Dr. Swain had an erection. So did the boy. So did Captain Bernard Daffodil-11 O'Hare, who stood by the helicopter nearby. Presumably, the erectile tissues in the widow's body were also engorged. "You know what you looked like on top of that cabinet, Mr. President?" said the boy. He was clearly sickened by what his disease was about to make him say. "No," said Dr. Swain. "Like the biggest baboon in the world trying to fuck a football," blurted the boy. Dr. Swain, in order to avoid any more insults like that, handed his remaining supply of tribenzodiportamil to the boy. The consequences of his withdrawal from tribenzodiportamil were spectacular. Dr. Swain had to be tied to a bed in the widow's house for 6 nights and days. Somewhere in there he made love to the widow, conceiving a son who would become the father of Melody Oriole II von Peterswald. Yes, and somewhere in there the widow passed on to him what she had learned from the Chinese, that they had become successful manipulators of the universe by combining harmonious minds. Yes, and then he had his pilot fly him to Manhattan, the island of death. He intended to die there, to join his sister in the afterlife, as a result of inhaling and ingesting invisible Chinese communists. Captain O'Hare, not wishing to die yet himself, lowered his president by means of a winch and rope and harness to the observation deck of the Empire State Building. The president spent the remainder of the day up there, enjoying the view, and then, breathing deeply with every few steps, hoping to inhale Chinese communists, he descended the stairs. It was twilight when he reached the bottom.
There were human skeletons in the lobby, in rotting nests of rags. The walls were zebra-striped with soot from cooking fires of long ago. There was a painting of Jesus Christ the Kidnapped on one wall. Dr. Swain for the first time heard the shuddering whir of bats leaving the subway system for the night. He considered himself to be already a dead man, a brother to the skeletons. But 6 members of the Raspberry family, who had observed his arrival by helicopter, suddenly came out of hiding in the lobby. They were armed with spears and knives. When they understood who they had captured, they were thrilled. He was a treasure to them, not because he was president, but because he had been to medical school. "A doctor! Now we have everything!" said one. Yes, and they would not hear of his wish to die. They forced him to swallow a small trapezoid of what seemed to be a tasteless sort of peanut brittle. It was, in fact, boiled and dried fish guts, which contained the antidote to the Green Death. Hi-ho. The Raspberries hustled him down to the financial district at once, for Hiroshi Raspberry 20 Yamashiro, the head of the family, was deathly ill. The man seemed to have pneumonia. Dr. Swain could do nothing for him but what physicians of a century before would have done, which was to keep his body warm and his forehead cool, and to wait. Either the fever would break or the man would die. The fever broke. As a reward, the Raspberries brought their most precious possessions to Dr. Swain on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. There was a clock radio, an alto saxophone, a fully fitted toiletries kit, a model of the Eiffel Tower with a thermometer in it, and on and on. From all this junk, and merely to be polite, Dr. Swain selected a single brass candlestick. And thus was the legend established that he was crazy about candlesticks. Thereafter, everybody would give him candlesticks. He did not like the communal life of the Raspberries, which required him, among other things, to jerk his head around perpetually in search of the kidnapped Jesus Christ. So he cleaned up the lobby of the Empire State Building and moved in there. The Raspberries supplied him with food. And time flew. Somewhere in there, Vera Chipmunk 5 Zappa arrived, and was given the antidote by the Raspberries. They hoped she would be Dr. Swain's nurse. And she was his nurse for a little while, but then she started her model farm. And little Melody arrived a long time after that, pregnant and pushing her pathetically worldly goods ahead of her in a dilapidated baby carriage. Among those goods was a Dresden candlestick. Even in the Kingdom of Michigan, it was well known that the legendary King of New York was crazy about candlesticks. Melody's candlestick depicted a nobleman's flirtation with a shepherdess at the foot of a tree trunk enlaced in flowering vines. Melody's candlestick was broken on the old man's last birthday. It was kicked over by Wanda Chipmunk 5 Rivera, an intoxicated slave. When Melody first presented herself at the Empire State Building and Dr. Swain came out to ask who she was and what she wanted, she went down on her knees to him. Her little hands were extended before her, holding the candlestick. "Hello, grandfather," she said. He hesitated for a moment, but then he helped her to her feet. "Come in," he said. "Come in, come in." Dr. Swain did not know at that time that he had sired a son during his withdrawal from tribenzodiazepamil in Urbana. He supposed that Melody was a random supplicant and fan. Nor did he bring to that first encounter any daydreams of having descendants somewhere. He had never much wanted to reproduce himself. So when Melody gave him shy but convincing arguments that he was an actual blood relative, he had a feeling that he, as he later explained to Vera Chipmunk 5 Zappa, had somehow sprung a huge leak, and out of that sudden painless opening, he went on, there crawled a famished child, pregnant and clasping a Dresden candlestick.
Hi-ho.
Melody's story was this. Her father, who was the illegitimate child of Dr. Swain and the widow in Urbana, was one of the few survivors of the so-called Urbana massacre. He was then pressed into service as a drummer boy in the army of the perpetrator of the massacre, the Duke of Oklahoma. The boy begat Melody at the age of 14. Her mother was a 40-year-old laundress who had attached herself to the army. Melody was given the middle name Oriole II to ensure that she would be treated with maximal mercy should she be captured by the forces of Stuart Oriole II Mott, the King of Michigan, the chief enemy of the Duke. And she was in fact captured when a 6-year-old, after the Battle of Iowa City, in which her father and mother were slain. Hi-ho. Yes, and the King of Michigan had become so decadent by then that he managed a seraglio of captured children with the same middle name as his, which of course was Oriole II. Little Melody was added to that pitiful zoo. But as her ordeals became more disgusting, so did she gain increasing inner strength from her father's dying words to her, which were these. "You are a princess. You are the granddaughter of the King of Candlesticks, of the King of New York." Hi-ho. And then, one night, she stole the Dresden candlestick from the tent of the sleeping king. Then Melody crawled under the flaps of the tent and into the moonlit world outside. Thus began her incredible journey eastward, ever eastward, in search of her legendary grandfather. His palace was one of the tallest buildings in the world. She would encounter relatives everywhere, if not orioles, then at least birds or living things of some kind. They would feed her and point the way. One would give her a raincoat, another would give her a sweater and a magnetic compass, another would give her a baby carriage, another would give her an alarm clock, another would give her a needle and thread, and a gold thimble too. Another would row her across the Harlem River to the island of death at the risk of his own life. And so on. Das Ende.